We're now swiftly moving to the African Center for Biodiversity.
I am Zakiyya Ismail. I am the Pesticide Research Coordinator at African Center for Biodiversity.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mariam Mayet. I'm the Executive Director at the ACB. Thank you very much.
So the African Center for Biodiversity is a primarily research and advocacy organization, and our work is to promote food sovereignty and agroecology across Africa. And that's the framework from which we're doing the submission today, and which is the framework within which we do all our research and our work. So we want to enter this conversation by talking about a food system that is not neutral. It is one that is dominated by industrial agriculture, and from our perspective, it's shaped by corporate interests. And as it functions at present, it is marked by multiple systemic failures and fragmented governance. And the consequence of this is that there are constitutional rights that are violated daily. Rights around health, life, human dignity, food, information, and environment. So, in practical terms, we're going to start with looking at some evidence of failure through the lens of genetically modified crops in South Africa. So let me start with a victory for South Africa, and that for ACB as well. And that is the landmark Constitutional Court victory, which took about 10 years of challenge for the court to set aside the approval of Monsanto's genetically modified maize. So what this court findings were is systemic irregularities, is showing chronic rubber stamping, and a failure to conduct evidence-based assessments. And this speaks to a system that is broken, and it's confirmed by the courts. And then genetically modified crops are in an unholy alliance with glyphosate and also 2,4-D. So glyphosate is one of the pesticides that's widely used in our agricultural systems, specifically in maize. And the safety of glyphosate has recently come under question. It was always under question, but we have now, because of the glyphosate study that was used globally and potentially in South Africa that established its safety, the study has been retracted. It was retracted because it was found to have ghostwriting by Monsanto employees. The authors had undisclosed conflicts of interest, and also their reliance of their evidence was internal, unpublished studies. So from that, those irregularities have seeped into how South Africa has been regulating glyphosate. Furthermore, there is in the US now litigation around the adverse effects of glyphosate, so there's like $11 billion in settlement. The evidence, other independent scientific evidence shows carcinogenity associated with glyphosate, endocrine disruption, gut microbiome destruction. Also concerning is that infants are at greater risk because of their immature organs and higher food consumption per body weight. Okay, thank you. So recently, ACB just took a sample of groceries, staples from our supermarkets, and baby food, and we just submitted it to a an accredited lab to establish what the glyphosate levels were in the foods. So we tested for glyphosate and EMPA, which is what degrades, what is found when glyphosate degrades. And this is relevant because EMPA has its own toxicological profile. However, there are no regulations around levels for EMPA. So what we found was that for example, impala maize meal, the maximum residue level, and in snowflake flour, the MRLs were exceeded. The interesting thing, though, is that there are no published MRLs for wheat because it's not supposed to be used with wheat. Glyphosate is usually used with genetically modified maize. And so, which brings us into kind of a treadmill. There's GM crops that are designed specifically to withstand applications of specific pesticides, which is glyphosate in this year at the moment. And so there's this, and so we have GM crops, and then we have those pesticides that go with it. However, we get into this treadmill because then there's glyphosate resistance by weeds, which means either higher levels of glyphosate or new chemicals, like 2,4-D or glufosinate ammonium. And so we're trapped in a vicious cycle of dependency. For reference, about 85% of South African maize is genetically modified, and 100% of soy and cotton is genetically modified. So pesticides are kind of built into our food system at the get-go. And the results tell us that if it's used on the farm, there's no way to keep it off our plates and out of our bodies. Okay, so because of the treadmill, we also then have 2,4-D coming into the problem, into our food system. 2,4-D is half of what Agent Orange was used as, and it's associated with birth defects, cancers, death, and it was approved in South Africa in 2019, despite objections. There's new evidence that's coming out on 2,4-Ds acting as an immunosuppressant, and ACB has made 2 submissions to the registrar with no response, and 1 to the minister with no response. And so we're seeing the silence as maybe an absence of governance. At the middle of 2025, ACB published a compendium on pesticides, which was documenting the harms of pesticides. So this compendium represents over 100 studies with 20 years of evidence, and it looks at, it shows us that there are human health risks, environmental risks, and then it also highlights the structural inequalities that, because it shifts the burden. The compendium is represented by a number of highly hazardous pesticides. Many of those are banned in the EU. They're manufactured there, they're exported here, and they're used or sold legally in South Africa. So those standards do not protect us here in Africa or in South Africa. And what's been rejected in other parts of the world is still exported to us, and this highlights the structural inequality. Also highlighted other systemic regulatory failures due to, as you've heard, Act 36 of 1947, which is 78 years old, and it predates what's happening now. It's also our experience in the compendium shows that there's ineffective oversight. The industry themselves are not being monitored, and if they are, it's not openly evident to us that how they're being monitored. We also have found that there's low international compliance. And then the science policy interface, because everybody wants good evidence, scientific evidence, but the funding for independent research is so severely lacking that it really hampers the engagement with the health and safety risks that people are facing. So right now there's an over-reliance on industry's data, and as we've seen that there is a built-in conflict of interest. Looking at it broadly, there are a number of constitutional rights being violated. Environment, access to healthcare, safe healthcare and food, life, human dignity, access to information, and just administrative action. And you may have heard in the previous presentation by Septoa, the ACB faces similar struggles in terms of trying to establish what are the pesticides out there, how are they being regulated, what's being used, where are they being used, how much is being used. So what we're asking for is, first of all, to ban all highly hazardous pesticides in line with global standards, and particularly those banned in Europe that are in use here in South Africa currently. To ban herbicide-tolerant GM crops, and to prohibit any new applications. And then to phase out other hazardous pesticides and replace them with safer agroecological alternatives. This, of course, then requires replacing our Act 36 with a modern framework that centers public health. And we need a strengthening of oversight failures and to apply the precautionary principle. So we're not 100% sure something is safe, then to rather not allow it into our food systems, onto our plates, into our bodies. So in summary then, if we persist with GM crop concentration, with corporate control of our seed systems, with rural chemical exposure, especially to farm workers, people living around those areas, if farmers are dependent on proprietary seeds from international companies, and if we have, we then risk our own seed sovereignty. We risk farmers' autonomy. We risk agricultural biodiversity, which ACB has at present made submissions which were meant to be discussed tomorrow on that aspect. We risk the death of our indigenous seed practices, and that would no longer exist. And so that access to information or lack of access to information means regulators, for our experience is that regulators then ignore our submissions, and there goes our culturally appropriate diets. So this is the opportunity to decide where do our priorities lie and how do we move in a supported way from that concentration with so many risks towards food system that is both to a food system that is socially just and environmentally just for people of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I may just categorically state that this is not what has been submitted to us, the PowerPoint presentation, nor is it in the written documentation that I've received. So I would ask you if you would give us a copy on the email links, so that we can also maybe respond more specifically to the examples that you have used. But nevertheless, I think your submission emphasizes that the right to food is a constitutional mandate and that it's currently being undermined by systemic pressures in South Africa's food and farming systems. And then you gave these examples that we did not have time, we didn't see before. But I would like to focus on the submission where you said that in order to comply with the global biodiversity frameworks, South Africa must update our national biodiversity strategies and action plan. And this it requires inclusive whole of society participation, yet our South African process lacks clear accessible mechanisms. So what concrete measures are being taken to remedy this reported lack?
I think that there's some confusion because ACB made 3 submissions to the Commission. One was on, I think, the compendium, which was a very big piece of research that we undertook that looked at 100 peer-reviewed and other published information and documents recording the impacts of pesticides on human health and the environment. That was submission number 1. Submission number 2 was in relation to GM crops and associated herbicides. In that second submission, we discussed glyphosate, 2,4-D, and glufosinate ammonium. In this respect, we pointed out that we had asked the government to review the registration of 2,4-D. We made substantive submissions. No response. In terms of glufosinate ammonium, we highlighted the deficiencies in the legislation, which Heidi already discussed, where a pesticide is banned and then exceptions are created called derogations, and that we opposed that derogation. Until today, we have no response from the government. And in the course of interrogating the application by about 5 or 6 agrochemical companies, we discovered that they were all copy-paste. The same risk assessment was furnished for all of the applications of derogation. So we combined the issues around associated herbicides with GM crops together. That was number 2. A separate submission was made. That's why we were given 2 slots, today and tomorrow. But we were contacted and asked to come today to present 2, and that is why 2 of us are here today. We made a 3rd submission, completely different, not dealing with pesticides and GM crops. This was around the global biodiversity framework, the 3 goals and 23 targets, where we specifically dealt with the interface between biodiversity and agriculture, and the obligations of our government to provide a civil society mechanism for consultation, and then to address the drivers for biodiversity loss and decline, and how we discuss the role of industrial agriculture and land use change within that context, and then discussing the need for a just transition, dealing particularly with the climate change target, the target dealing with agroecology, and then linking it up also with target 7 of the GBF dealing with pesticides. But because of time constraints, we were asked to come today. But you ran short of time. So Zakiyya started first with presentation number 1, which was on associated herbicides. And she didn't discuss, we made a completely separate presentation on the GBF and the targets, but there's no time. So that's I think, I'm trying to clear up the confusion for the Commission, and I apologize if we didn't make that clear from the outset when we started the presentation.
Well, thank you, because that really clarified, but I have not interrogated your submission 1 and 2. I did not have access to it. But, so I wonder if I can, Eileen, if I can give a microphone to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to also be very quick based on the same reasons that my fellow evidence leader has pronounced on. But I found the reference to the SCA judgment and the Concord dismissal very helpful because of the question that I want to put to you, whether you would deem almost the same playbook being applicable with the Monsanto arguments, the lack of regulatory oversight, the reliance on almost one-sided evidence. You've made mention. Okay, you've made mention of a lack of funded research, independent funded research. Would you argue that if we superimpose the Monsanto arguments onto pesticides, that there are similarities that can carry across?
I think that there are similarities in the sense that, and we don't want to throw stones at the government because we understand that they're doing their best. We are not here to undermine administrative justice and decision making. We want to make that clear. We would like to have friendly and good relationships with our government. But we do understand the issue of lack of capacity, because I would imagine that the office of the registrar must be inundated with applications for registration, re-registration, extension of permits, because we deal, and we've dealt with GMOs and the registrar in decision making for the past 25 years. And if you look at the list of permits being granted, it's astronomical. So one could well imagine that there could be enormous capacity constraints. You're dealing with highly technical matters because in the realm of pesticides, it's all about chemistry. You need to know a great deal about these chemicals. It's not just the active ingredients, there's the co-ingredients, the adjuvants that go with it. In the field of GMOs, for example, it's a lot of molecular biology, and then you need to know quite a lot about agronomy, because it's all about what's happening in the field, as well as understand chemistry and the whole realm of associated herbicides. And GM crops are also grown with pesticides, not only herbicides, because it's within the industrial agriculture realm. So I would say, and also the way that the risk assessment is not done by government. Risk assessment itself is done by the agrochemical company. It's then submitted with applications to government. Government does a desktop assessment against which it would have a set of guidelines that it will tick to see whether certain criteria have been met or not, and then would grant applications. I would say that if one just recalls what Ms. Swanby had testified, and she said that the registry of agrochemicals is kept by CropLife, and in order to access that you would have to so this also shows the lack of capacity of government to manage the database and manage its own registration system around agrochemicals, and then this unacceptable situation of conflict of interest, because how could an agrochemical industry hold and manage the registration database of agrochemicals in the country? So I would say that, I won't say that it's just blind rubber stamping, but I would say that we haven't had any success in our representations to government to consider re-registration of agrochemicals, and we haven't had any response to that application for more than 2 years. And we even wrote to the minister when he was appointed, Minister Steenhuisen, and we thought, well, maybe a fresh minister will be better and we will have more joy. Nothing. No response to our application for derogation. This is very, very unusual because we do not have a similar experience with the Department of Agriculture dealing with GMOs. We get very good responses from the registrar as well as from the executive committee who is in charge of decision making there. It's a very, very different situation. So I would say there's something that needs to be investigated in the office of the registrar dealing with agrochemicals under under Act 36 of 1947, in terms particularly of capacity in that office, if we do not even get a response for more than 2 years.
I do deem it very valuable that you were able to superimpose the concepts developed in the SCA judgment onto the current discourse. I recognize you also pointing out there may be a capacity concern at the registrar's office as well as the department's office, because you have tabled with us that not only have there not been any engagement on the substance of these concerns, but you have not even had a response. So certainly two things that we are going to follow up on. And then perhaps, Commissioners, I just want to also table that this is the second time we have been referred to CropLife, bearing in mind that they are playing a quasi-governmental role in coordinating information that should be in the public, not only public interest, but in the public domain. I would like to implore the panel to consider inviting, in terms of our legislation, also them to respond to the allegations that have been tabled with the Commission under oath. Thank you very much, Commissioner, and that is all from my side. Over to you, Chairperson.
Commissioner Ntuli, any questions?
Thank you very much, colleagues, for your presentation. Perhaps just as a follow-up, are you able to clarify for those who might still be confused the three, or the relationship between these three, the Department of Agriculture, CropLife, and the registrar? If you could perhaps just assist us in understanding these three as well as their interface or interrelationship. That would be the first question.
As we understand the position, CropLife is a body that represents the interests of the agrochemical industry. They also exist internationally, but we do have a presence in South Africa. We routinely cross swords with them in international fora where we've known them for a long time because we were involved together with many other groups over the years trying to negotiate many international treaties, and they were very present in the negotiations of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, for example, in not wanting a protocol and not wanting the international regulation of genetically modified organisms. And they're also very present in other international fora dealing with pesticides, and our colleagues who attend those will be able to testify to that. I have to say that if you look at, just to come back to your question about the relationship between the Department of Agriculture and CropLife, what was very instructive to us was the Minister of Agriculture's responses immediately after the 5 children died of tuberphos poisoning in Naledi, Soweto. and it was almost a copy-paste, his position and that of CropLife, immediately blaming the spaza shops, blaming illegal imports from neighboring countries, all unsubstantiated. And in fact, the registrar of Act 36 of 1947 gave evidence to the Portfolio Committee on Agriculture that they in fact found manufacturers of turbifos in the country. So the relationship between CropLife and the department is definitely something that needs further investigation. And the reason being that we are always shut down by the narrative that food security will be imperiled and people will starve in South Africa if we do not use pesticides. And the minister, there was a headline in the Cape Times, and it said, pesticides or turbifos not being the banning not being in the offing anytime soon. It was just very clear, even before any investigation by Parliament was underway. So this stance by the Department of Agriculture to defend the use of agrochemicals, to defend CropLife, whereas he has and his department constitutional obligations, as we all know, also to protect human life and the environment, not only one industry. Of course, he has to take all economic interests into account. We understand that. But this unholy alliance, which became apparent when those children died, and the reaction of the minister was really very, very difficult for us to accept. And if it wasn't for Cabinet and the 3 jurors who presided over the tribunal that Heidi testified to, who themselves gave testimony to Parliament, and the position taken independently by the South African Human Rights Commission on the issue, and the issue of pesticides that have nothing to do with us. This has to do with their own work and their own credibility and their own agency. We would not have had a cabinet decision to ban turbifos. So I think that the registrar is a person we feel very sorry for, because the registrar has to be in the firing line, taking a lot of heat from all of us. But the registrar is just a government official, whereas the political responsibility lies further up. I'm sorry.
No, don't
Commissioner.
be sorry. I appreciate your response, but I'm just a little bit concerned about time, and I have 2 more questions which I will squeeze into.
Sorry, Commissioner.
Not a problem, Mariam. Thank you so much for your response. It has been helpful. It is a fact that our agricultural industry is heavily dependent on pesticide use, and therefore the agrochemical cooperations. You are equally correct to say the response from the ministry has often been that if you ban highly hazardous pesticides, then you are also then going to see a hike in food insecurity. What, from your experience and your research, would a just transition be from highly hazardous pesticides? If we were to ban all of the highly hazardous pesticides today, what does a transition, a realistic transition, look like? Given also the reality that many, if not the majority, of small-scale farmers also rely on pesticides for crop protection. So if we ban all of these HHPs today, what does the transition look like in realistic form? That would be my last question. Thank you so much.
A very difficult question, and I don't want to preempt a presentation that will be made tomorrow by a big coalition who made a submission on a just transition that we also made inputs into. But I don't think that we want to precipitate any kind of food security crisis in the country. We also understand that the industrial agriculture sector is caught in what we call a technological lock-in. The lock-in is deeply embedded and is not going to be an overnight transition out of. It's going to have to be phased. And I don't think we can talk about any phase out of industrial agriculture without the commercial farmers and the industry sitting at the table as well to knock out what this transition would mean to a more socially just and ecologically sustainable alternative. The first thing is that they are locked into what, when I talk about a technological package, it's corporate seed, it's pesticides, it's inorganic fertilizer, and it's irrigation, credit. It's a whole bundle of issues. And the pesticide is part of this package. It can't be, it must be dealt with in a very comprehensive way. I think our colleagues tomorrow will come and talk about the mechanisms and steps towards a just transition. And I think that there's been a lot of evidence, and I think Dr. May, Julian May, also was asked the same question, and I think he also responded. We also will publish some work in the next couple of months detailing how successful other farming systems are that do not depend on the use of pesticides. And this is not just integrated pest management. It's also the application of the pull-pull methodologies, many applications that find their home in the basket of agroecological practices. So the evidence is there, and I think it's going to have to be a phasing out of the use, particularly of highly hazardous pesticides and organic organophosphates in particular. I think that, unfortunately, because of the confusion around the three submissions, we dealt in particular with the issue of where would the resources come from, the resource mobilization issues. And we highlighted in particular harmful subsidies. So our government subsidizes the agrochemical industry. There's a lot of tax breaks being given to support industrial agriculture. So the whole issue around harmful subsidies would have to be part of the discussion, and how some of this money and finances can be redirected to supporting a just transition. So that would be my short answer.
Thank you,
Commissioner.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And then just to emphasize also for the record that we have received all three submissions, but we have received an overwhelming number of submissions overall for this inquiry. And we have not invited everyone who has made written submissions, but we have sampled based on the submissions and also based on the thematic areas that we are focusing on. So even though we have today focused on one of these submissions, which is on pesticides, we can assure you that all three of them are being considered.
We appreciate you must have received overwhelming submissions. The food system is extremely important, and it has so many dimensions, and we very much appreciate this opportunity. Thank you very much. And also your assurance that all three will be taken into account. And we wish you well with your onward work, and we will be sure to send you that correspondence in the next couple of days. Thank you very, very much indeed. And good luck with your work.